Right, good afternoon, everyone. I trust you can hear me. Do let me know if you can't. And yeah, thanks for taking the time out of your busy lunch hours to listen to me and watch me really try to cram more than 100 years of history, because it's not just the 18th century as fixed from 1700 to 1800, but I'd like to drag you into the long 18th century as well, into the 18 teens and 20s, to really see the impacts and the outcomes of the Black presence in London during this extraordinary period. Now, inevitably, I'm going to do some injustice to some of these illustrious characters and events that I'll be sharing with you. But what I really want to do is to excite you about this period and to give you an idea of the extraordinary human potential, diversity, spectrum of personality, um, incredible stories, which really lay the underpin Quamino's world. Now, here's where I try to share my screen with everybody. Mhm. Apparently, I'm sharing my screen now. Do let me know if I'm not. And I'm going to go to the slideshow. Right. I'm going to be delivering this at breakneck speed to allow some time for Q&A. So here we go. Right. When we think about 18th century London, the most stereotypical, hackney and cliched view is sort of summed up in the image that you can see before you. This representation of genteel folk having tea, or is it coffee, at Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. And on the left is the inevitable, the stock character of the young Black servant. We think, or we're given to understand, or to always infer the presence of uh, the Black presence is summed up in this position of servitude, being by the side, standing, being obedient, and always dressed up in these ridiculous turbans and some sort of finery which offsets the glory of this company here playing cards. And these images tend to do is to obscure, in fact, muddy and besmirch the presence of an extraordinary array of people of various statuses. We have people who are literally beggars in the streets. We have people who are property owners. We have a lot of business people, so a very large number of business people for various reasons. Um, we have a lot of very happy families. We have sailors, but we have also some great minds which are making extraordinary changes in the Atlantic world. Okay, let me rush on, because when we think about the Black presence in Georgian Britain, we tend to focus on the fact, the idea, notion even, that most of these people are from elsewhere. It's that historical othering of the Black presence, which makes us assume that these individuals are from Africa, which they are, many of them, the Caribbean, which they are, many of them, and from North America, up until and after it becomes the United States, which again, some of them were. But more interestingly, what you're seeing from the beginning of the century is a succession of people who are being born here, who are being born in the capital, not just the capital, but throughout the British Isles. People start to be born here generationally. And here's a ridiculous instance, which I'll just read parts of it out because it's pretty distasteful in some of it. But yeah, it's about a christening, a baptism um, at St. Giles Cripplegate in 1726. And they describe the procession. And it says, thus came the reputed father. He's described as a guinea black, a very clever, well dressed fellow, and another black who was to be the godfather. Secondly, the midwife, or rather her deputy, a white woman carrying the little sooty pagan who was to be metamorphosed into a Christian. Thirdly, the mother, who was also a black, but not of the Guinea breed, a well shaped, well dressed, genteel woman. Fourthly, two intended godmothers, attended by 6 or 8 more, all Guinea blacks, as pretty, genteel girls as could be girt with a girdle, and setting aside the complexion, enough to tempt an old frozen anchorite to have cracked a commandment with any, you know where that's going. So There's a lot in there. There's a lot in there. But what it does do, which matters, is that it focuses our attention on the Black presence in a way which many parties are historically unused to. It sets the fact that people have started being born here generationally. Um, and it gives the impression as well that this particular family are not enslaved people, which the majority of Black people here were not actually enslaved. They were in situations of the underclass, in beggary, in suffering, the very opposite of Bridgerton, although a little sprinkle of that stuff might have to come into my presentation. But what you do find is that you have a lot of people like this, just you'd say workaday, ordinary people. They're well dressed. They seem to be integrated. The midwife, or rather her deputy, is a white woman who's carrying the young child. And it's a part of history which isn't spoken about. But of course, it's not all plain sailing. And there's another side to all of this, which is that by the 1780s, late 1770s, 1780s, Great Britain is the world's largest trader in human lives, particularly across the Atlantic. And there's a huge amount of money being made out of it. The sugar and slave men are the bedrock of the city of London. Sorry, my chair's abandoning me. Bear with me. And you still have the institution of enslavement, of slavery, not just in the plantation societies, which are largely out of sight and out of mind, but also it has to be remembered that there were individual enslaved people who were brought here, as well as having that body of people who were household servants. Here are two examples of runaways. The one on the left is describing a man who I believe was a household servant. I don't believe he was owned, someone owned his life, but it describes how this man by the name of Peter, 5'7", has run away from Mr. Mason's in Bishopsgate Street near Cornhill, and gives that wholesome description which is necessary in a world without photography. And of course, there's a reward of 2 guineas. And I like the last sentence there. Or if he will return, he will be kindly received. Maybe. But more tellingly is the example on the right, which is from 1763, who describes how on the 11th of November, again, Bishopsgate Street, a Negro woman named Sylvia, the property of Mr. Samuel Gregory of the island of Jamaica, she has run away. And it describes her as well. She's 25-year-old, 25, speaks tolerable good English, and supposed to be with child. What I find really extraordinary, looking at these runaway notices, of which there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in the papers of this era, the publications of this era, is that many of these runaways, the majority of them, are young people, and they are making the most extraordinary decision any human can make, which is a young person can make, which is they've decided to chart their own future, to craft their own independence, to go for autonomy, come what may. And the extraordinary thing about it is that many of them actually did make a clear run. They got their freedom. They managed to start new lives for themselves. A lot of the young boys went into the Navy or the merchant service. A lot more just went into that large drifting sets of underclasses. They were, as Fielding said about Black people moving into the Covent Garden and St Giles area, London. Some of you might be familiar with it. He described that these young servants and runaways, they would become intoxicated with liberty, as well you might be intoxicated with liberty, and they find themselves being taken onto the body of the mob. So the existing underclasses, the traditional underclasses in that area, which have been largely Irish, just took them in. And yes, there was an underclass. There certainly was, because there had to be. Yes. So there's another section which I really don't have time for. But I can't refrain from adding. Describing also went off from the ship St. Elizabeth, Captain Shaw, on the 17th of November, a Negro boy named Lothario. Imagine calling a young boy Lothario, really. The property of the said Mr. Gregory, and it describes what he's got on. He's 18, and again, whoever has information for them shall receive a 5 guineas reward. But again, clearly that's a subject unto itself entire. But it's important just to set the scene that lying at the bottom of all of these experiences is the history and the tradition of enslavement, of suffering, of people as products. And that is one's assumed status or set of relationships, one way or another. But of course, that wasn't the whole of life. What you have here as well isn't just the appearance of Black people, it's the appearance of Black culture, inevitably. And this note from 1764 from London Chronicle describes how, amongst the sundry fashionable routs or clubs that are held in town, that of the Blacks or Negro servants is not the least. On Wednesday last night, no less than 57 of them, men and women, supped, drank, and entertained themselves with dancing and music consisting of violins, French horns, and other instruments at a public house in Fleet Street till 4 in the morning. No whites were allowed to be present, for all the performers were blacks, which is interesting, that last sentence, that all the performers were blacks, because already by the 1760s, you have this fashion as, this paragraph sort of contradicts itself, as mentioned in the first sentence here, of the fashionable routes, the fashionable clubs are those which are held by Black people. And in our sort of chronocentric notion of culture, whereby we always associate Blackness with the modern, Blackness is synonymous with the contemporary or the cutting edge. We really just have to shift that view and change it and sort of start placing people who look like me in periods like this in particular ways. And one of those ways is culturally. By the 1760s, there were Black places of Black entertainment, there were Black clubs, there were Black public houses, which we'll see an example in a short while, and already Black language, which we'll see later on, and slang and patois is already starting to percolate through society. But in terms of, as I said, Black entertainments and Black places of resorts, they're all, one of the things which fascinates me is that under these extraordinarily pressurized lives, there was an explosion of enterprise of all sorts. Again, those of you who know London might know this pub. It's the Cock and Lion, and it's on Wigmore Street, close to the Wigmore Hall. Anyone who wants to go to any classical music recitals, this is the pub which is closest to it, and it's the Cock and Lion in Wigmore Street. And this was one of the many Black Kens or Black pubs, which were basically pubs where the landlord was a Black man, or the overwhelming majority of its clientele were Black. And this wasn't just a London phenomenon, it was something which was nationwide. You had Black pubs and Black Kens in, of course, the port cities, but even going back to the 1670s and 80s in Northampton. As you can see, this pub is still pulling pipes, as are several of the other Black Kens. Unfortunately, the most famous of them was the Horse and Dolphin, and that was owned by the African-American bare-knuckle boxer Bill Richmond. And again, for those of you who know London, that was to one side of the National Theatre, and it was one of the most glamorous and glitzy public houses in London. But there's so many stories here, so many stories about Black enterprise in particular, which are sort of counter to the usual drudgery and blues singing and the defeatedness, which is often presented as Black history. Oh yeah, interesting person. Cesar Picton, gentleman, 1755, 1836. Cesar Picton was born on the island of Gorée in Senegal, that disgusting depot for human lives. And he was brought at the age of 6 to this country. So he started life as property. And when he died, these two houses were two of the properties that he owned, amongst a number of other properties that he owned. Um, he had been given not just his freedom, but also an amount of money which he used very wisely, through thrift, industry, piety, and all of those likable qualities he applied to become a very successful coal merchant, coal haulier, and he also owned wharfs. Yeah, these properties, both called Picton House, the one on the left is on Kingston upon Thames, and the one on the right is in Thames Ditton. But what this really does fascinate me, the proliferation of Black business people or grocers or employment service owners who just find ways to make money because they have to. But of course, a lot of them are like this gentleman, Cesar Picton, who literally was described as a gentleman on his death. That's how he was known. And of course, that wasn't just a name, it was also a title. Okay, and talking about titles, I don't want to go into Bridgerton territory too much at all, but it has to be said that yes, there were wealthy Black people in Britain during this time. Not all of them nice people at all. Some of them are horrifically compromised, like Nathaniel Wells, who was the sheriff of Monmouthshire. His father was a plantation owner. His mother was an enslaved woman. He owned Piercefield House, one of the largest properties in South Wales. And these people were fantastically rich. There's a whole slew of people who are born of those impure connections between plantation owners and some of the women whose lives they owned, or other Black women. And those who were fortunate enough to find favor in their father's eyes, some of them would be sent out of the islands and have to Britain, usually London, and they'd have money settled on them. And they're noted, they are noticed. They can't go under any radar if they had radar in 1802, particularly Hester Piozzi, who's writing here in this little extract, haunted by black shadows. She's writing, gossiping to one of her one of her circle. Let me be nice. One of her circle. She's writing to Penny Pennington. Well, I'm really haunted by black shadows, men of color in the rank of gentlemen, a black lady covered with finery in the pit at the opera, and tawny meaning children of mixed background, and tawny children playing in the squares, the gardens of the squares, I mean, with their nurses. She's exasperated because, of course, she's talking about the squares, which are the new sets of squares which are being created for the newly wealthy classes, and also the already moneyed classes building away from central London, these lovely sets of Georgian squares. And of course, to have access to the gardens, you'd have to live in the squares or be wealthy enough to live in the squares, and therefore you have to be someone of means. So this is obviously worrying her. In fact, this piece goes on to describe how it will lead to the downfall of civilization, and you can join up the rest. It's not an unknown message. So, but we still have to get back to the fact that apart from these sets of people who are doing well for themselves by any standards, you have the mass of Black people who are suffering. You find some of them in settlement examinations where people are trying to qualify for poor relief or establish themselves as being qualified for poor relief very quickly. This example of Sarah Paulson in 1790, a single woman, that she was born of a Negro woman, the property of John Gray in the island of Jamaica, that he, the said John Gray, brought her, this examiner, as his servant from Jamaica to the Kingdom of Great Britain. She continued in his service for several years together in Great Britain. Last year or thereabouts, she lived with him in the parish of Tottenham. Long story short, she becomes pregnant and he takes her down far away from Tottenham to around about what's now St. Thomas's Hospital, slightly on the south bank. They're lying in hospital, and she's looking for some sort of poor relief because, as it says, she was delivered of a male bastard child which hadn't yet been baptized and which child is now living. Now, this is really quite serious because there was this sort of explosion of religiosity amongst was evidence of very high religiosity amongst black people in Britain, particularly this rush to be baptized in Church of England amongst Church of England congregations. And part of the reason, apart from hyper religious mania, is the fact that once you are part of a congregation, you are known to the parish. You are no longer a stranger in the parish. You can possibly have access to poor relief. And in case after case of black women who are with child, excuse the period language, with bastard children, they have a stronger case. They can make a stronger case if they're known to the parish. But the whole religious side is something which I'd better not get started on. But yes, one of the things which makes parts of my work much easier is that there is this superabundance of material on the lives of black settlers in Britain in the 18th century through baptisms, burials, and marriages. Okay, the reason my eyes keep flicking up is that I'm very mindful of the time here. So I'm really going to try and keep my remarks short. Um, right, so another thing that's happening, as I said, is that there is this underclass, and amongst the underclass are black people. Um, the You see evidence of this in, for example, this scene here. This etching of the Gordon riots in June 1780, which were 4 days and nights of the bloodiest riots in British domestic history. Interestingly, nobody ever talks about it. They started off as anti-Catholic riots. Haven't got the time to really go the deep dive on this. They started off as anti-Catholic riots, but after a day or so, this being London, it just becomes excuse me, it becomes a free for all. Everybody goes into the streets to get theirs in an era where there are no police. There's no police force, and this scene you see in front of you is a depiction of the taking of Newgate Jail, the ugliest, most brutal jail in London. And the taking of Newgate involved the piling up of combustible stuffs, as was outlined in the court before the house of the jail keeper. And basically, part of the jail was burnt down. A lot of the prisoners ran out. I think upwards of 600 people were actually murdered during the Gordon riots. But the long story short is that you can see, I mean, yes, this is the part of the show called, part of the presentation called Spot the Black Man. But you can see that there are, as was attested by some witnesses, there are blacks and tawnies. That word again about people of mixed background. There are blacks and tawnies amongst this crowd about to burn down the part of Newgate Jail. And amongst them were a couple of, interesting African Americans again, Benjamin Bowsey and John Glover, who were actually caught and tried for their participation, or they claimed that John Glover was one of the leaders of the attack on the jail. And yeah, they're actually sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, but they didn't because they joined the British Army. They were given the option, and they ended up being sent to West Africa, of all places. But yes, often the black presence was assumed to be, a sort of motive energy behind these incidences of rioting within the larger tumult. And the case, Charlotte Gardner, she was a young woman who was caught at leading a riot, supposedly on an Italian's pub in St. Catherine's Dock. And when it came to court, she wasn't the only one to hang, but she did hang. In fact, she was the last woman to hang at Tower Hill. And if you come to London, come to Tower Hill, you can actually see that there is a plaque which mentions that this is the site where the last woman was hung at Tower Hill, but it doesn't mention her ethnicity at all or the context in which she came to be swinging from the end of a rope. Okay, right. One of the places you saw a lot of black labor was in the British Army and the Royal Navy. Here's a twee little representation of guards at St. James, and you can see the sort of ornamental use of black men in this tableau. You've got them again with these turbans and peacock feathers, and basically that whole sort of, it's called the Turkish style of dress, which is about as Turkish as I am or they are. And this Turkish style of dress, they're also playing some sort of Turkish style of music. The instruments they use were supposedly originally from Turkey. And this is very popular all across Europe. Where the British Army was somewhat different was that there were actually black men in the formal ranks, in the fighting ranks, particularly during the campaigns in North America, when the offer was there to enslaved black men to join the British Army against the rebels, in return for which they will be given their freedom. Of course, you know, the British adventure in that part of the planet collapsed, and suddenly you have this huge number of astonishingly desperate black men, black loyalists and their families who need to get as far away from what's going to become the United States as quickly as they can. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them came here. More went to Nova Scotia, but you know, that whole mini diaspora is really interesting in itself. But many of them came here, as did many of the sailors, and of course, that many of them were unskilled. They just knew war, or they just had their maritime trades and crafts. So you had scenes like this from 1786, which I'll paraphrase here, describes how these objects of distress and misery are the 700 black people in and about London who are starving about the streets. And this article is referring in particular to the seamen. They're not talking about the soldiers, who are a whole other set of issues, but these seamen who were in some ways dumped here. And it goes to say that one of the solutions to the presence of these seamen and their families, or these blacks and their families, intruding upon the observation of the great and the good, was to, as it says here, set up a subscription for sending them to Africa, of which country many of them are natives. Of course, many of them absolutely nothing about Africa, but that country. Now, it says they are now embarking on board 2 ships, and actually there are 3 ships in the River Thames for Sierra Leone, an English settlement on the coast of Guinea where they'll be encouraged to settle. So what you saw, 1786, 1787, was the removal, the expulsion of, I think, about 350 of the black poor to the Sierra Leone settlement. And only, 60 of them were still living after, I think, less than 7 years, because of course they had no relationship to the country of Sierra Leone, and they were perfect strangers to the people and the perils of that place. It's a very interesting story. Unfortunately, I could talk about that all night, but I'm going to stop here. Yeah, this was a partial passenger list of one of those vessels, the Belisarius. And it's interesting, this section of the passenger list, because you can see, and I hope you can see that on one side is listed black women who are married to white men who are going down. The other side is black men who are married to white women who will also be making the journey. So you can draw one of 2 conclusions here. One, that the racism that they were suffering was so bad that they decided as a family unit or couples to just go to somewhere where they had probably no connections whatsoever. Or there's a sign that intermarriage is all very nice and everyone's very cheerful, just singing the okey pokey and getting along together. in merry old England. But yeah, something to discuss. It's interesting. Have to move on. Right. This is what's really happening for me as someone who loses himself in old writing and dusty stuff. The fact that London is the center of a literary and philosophical revolution. London is the place where you see, for the first time in English-speaking history, Black thought um, being produced and disseminated for a majority white readership. And of course, at the core, driving all of this publishing, driving all of this writing, this learning, is the battle for abolition. The battle for abolition, which becomes the largest, um, becomes the largest political movement in public political movement in British history. And the gentleman depicted on the frontispiece of this book is probably the highest profile of has the highest profile amongst these writers, and it's Alauda Equiano. Far too interesting for me to go into detail about him, but here is someone who ended up buying his own freedom, settling here, and he publishes this, his interesting narrative, or the life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustav Vasa, the African, written by himself in 1789. And there's a depiction of him on the left, and it shows him with his lovely pampered and primed primped hair. He's got his nice riding coat on. He's looking very balanced and measured, not like he wants to kill anyone because he's had a life as an enslaved person. And he's got his Bible open in his right hand, looking at the book of Acts. It's a lovely piece of public relations. And if you haven't read it, please do read The Life of Olaudah Equiano. You can download it for free off the internet. Gutenberg has some decentish copies of it, but there are other places you can just download it. It's everywhere, as are most of my favorite reading. Yeah, so this explosion of writing addressing slavery, Equiano's take is that we are Christians. He's got the book open there. He says, we are Christians, we are one flesh in the body of Christ, though our skins are black, etc., etc., etc. And of course, someone like of my inclinations is not going to be 100% happy with it, but it has to be conceded that it worked. It was a bestseller, and it went into editions after his death, and it set his daughter up in some leisure as well. But more importantly, it put Black witness and testimony to the horrors of slavery top front and center of what people were talking about. As did this man's work, Ignatius Sancho, chubby gentleman on the left. He was a Westminster shopkeeper, and he was a letterist. He was, when I say Westminster, I should put it in context here. He had a shop in what was then King Charles Street, which was one block down from Downing Street. So it's the next block down from Downing Street, going towards Westminster, and going towards the Houses of Parliament. So here he is in the very center of London, and he's someone who's got a lot going for him. He's very wealthy. He owns property again. He gets money from his property. He married a West India woman, she was described as, though I believe she was British born, called Anne. They have four children who lived. Might get that wrong, but I'm wrong. However, here they have a happy family life. And because he has property, he also, and gets rent from property, he also has the vote. So he's a voter. And the vote was a privilege which the majority of white British people, actually 95% of British people, did not have the vote. Yet Ignatius Sancho and a handful of other Black men did. But yes, you can see here, I won't read it out because I'm going to run out of time, that his opinions on slavery. But his letters are a fantastic read, because it's just like walking into a Black family in 18th century London who live in the heart of London. And even though they have a lot of privileges, he's totally aware of, that sense which you get a century or so later, century and a half later with Dubois, sorry, you used to call him Du Bois, his double consciousness. He's very aware of the fact. He writes in one letter from 1773, I am only a lodger here and hardly that. And he also writes to the English, we are all either mulish or foolish without exception. Fascinating man. Read his books rather than listen to me praise him. So axillate to the root, we're going into the long 18th century here. We're going to 1817, and I'm just including this to show you the proliferation of like Creole or Patois in this period. And this was a publication produced by one Robert Wedderburn, who's my favorite person. I haven't got time to go into him, but you'll understand why in a moment. What he's doing here in issue 3 of the Axillate to the Root, or A Fatal Blow to the Oppressors. Robert Wedderburn was Mr. Blood and Fire. He wasn't coming with any sort of meek, well-mannered, considered opinions. He was really talking about blood and fire. He starts this issue, slave stealing and murder tolerated by a British jury. Pardon my patois. It goes, tap thief, that England man, the white man, the Christian bokra thief me pickney. He got hungry, he got yam him. Oh, there go another, he thief him mama. He be a Catholic Christian, he goes on, he goes on, he goes on. What's interesting is that he's writing for 2 audiences. One audience is, or set of readers, is literate Black people in the colonies, particularly in Jamaica, where he disperses this information through the networks of seafarers and mariners. And it comes under the gaze of the Jamaica Assembly, who try to ban it, of course. And the other set of readers are the ordinary, lower class, white, literate Londoners who, by this period, they are familiar with Black English, as we'd say. They're familiar with Patois and Creole. If you look at the dictionaries of the time, like Gross's Dictionary of the Vulgar Tongue, 1788, then you'll see that there are words of African origin, of Black origin, etc. It's absolutely fascinating. And so is Robert Wedderburn, Mr. Blood and Fire, and Mr. Publisher. Okay, I'm going to finish on this one because 1773, you see Phyllis Wheatley in London. I imagine many of you will be familiar with this, the life of this young lady who was taken from the Senegambia region, I think at the age of 12, possibly younger. But she ended up working for the Boston lawyer, John Wheatley, who entertained himself by teaching his enslaved person to read and write. She excelled, so much so that he tried her with the classics, ditto, and she started putting her thoughts and sentiments into poetry. And she's more famous for, I should say that her poetry was published in Britain in London in 1773, because there wouldn't have been a suitable publisher in North America. That wasn't the point of her being literate. But it's a very messy set of variables involved in Phyllis's life, and a lot of her work, including the poem on being brought in being taken from Africa to America, brought to America from Africa, which is questionable and fascinating. But this is, for me, the poem which really sums up not just Phyllis's work, but also the work of all the other Black writers and the individual Black writers of Britain at that time, because they had this thing, which she describes here, imagination, which allowed them to recreate themselves and to embed themselves in history. And here she describes the whole process in how we on thy pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star, the mental optics rove, measure the skies and range the realms above. There, in one view, we grasp the mighty whole, or with new worlds amaze the unbounded soul. At which point I'm going to leave this and see if there are any questions.
Steve, that was fascinating. And thank you so much for taking us through all of that. I know that there were a lot of areas where we could definitely go into more detail. Quamino's map picks up after the American Revolution, similar to Incomparable World. And it's interesting that you brought up the religious movement and religious aspect, because we have a character in the opera who is a reverend and is a central character to the show. And we also, I'm so thrilled you included that military aspect, because we have a captain character as well who is really prominent in the show. But what I'm curious to hear from you about, and I think something that rings close to all of our hearts here at Chicago Opera Theater, is the position of musicians in this society. For our story in Quamino's map, the main character is a musician, and obviously struggling to find his place. But do you have any kind of examples or stories of where musicians fall in all of this?
They fell all over the place, as you can imagine. I mean, the story is never linear or simple even. For example, Ignatius Sancho, whom we met, he was not just a shopkeeper and a belletriste, he was also a composer. There are more than 60 pieces of music that we've found, that he produced. Also, the popular music of the period, we don't know what that sounded like, but in that description from the 1760s of the black rout, the black hop, you get the description of the instruments they're using, but not of the sort of music they were playing. Similarly, we know that a lot of the black music that you would have heard, on the streets by street performers like Billy Waters, who became king of the beggars, and actually, 200 years from his death next year. But all of these people were street performers, and they'd be performing sort of either black music, or some of them were just singing sea shanties, which again have a very strong African American or African elements to them, call and response. But in terms of just people earning their lives as musicians, of course you have, non-British people like the Chevalier de Saint-Georges, who was a composer par excellence, who was in Britain briefly, and George Bridgetower as well, who was one of the favorites of King George in the following century. And so I mean, it's very messy. There's no one size fits all or one perfect answer, but there's a lot of room to play in. Yeah.
Brilliant. No, that's excellent. There's also, we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A that we can pull from. I'm curious to hear a little bit about this because you touched on this, but somebody said earlier shared, your presentation has stayed away from specific commentary about Bridgerton, but curious minds would like to ask if you have thoughts about ways this history is better shared. And we must add, Quamino's map offers a great start to learning more about the shared Black history of America and the UK.
Yes, it does. I'll go back to front. Of course, this is one of the great things about these histories, is that they do straddle the Atlantic. They straddle the Atlantic world, not just Great Britain and the United States, but also the Caribbean and also Africa, because those are the people who you have here. These are the lives you have as you're walking around anywhere in London. You're literally in the footsteps of Black people who are living here 200, 300 years ago, from all those points in the Atlantic world. And it's very important to stress that, you can go immediately from the local to the national to the global stories and issues in 2 or 3 steps. Now, as far as Bridgerton goes, I'm not a fan. I'm openly bigoted about it. I think it's done a huge disservice to the telling of histories, because it has attracted attention, because it has addressed the lack of Black characters of status. There's this huge hunger for Black characters of status or having high social profiles, but it just went overboard. I concede there were Black characters of very high status. There were people who had very comfortable livings, in the Royal Navy as well. You have Black midshipmen, Black captains, Black ship's doctors until 1811. But it's done a huge disservice, because it's, in a sense, it set the template and it set expectations, particularly from young people. and people are not familiar with the messiness and the ugliness of history and in all its contradictory glory, people are going to be, the money is there to produce that sort of spectacular and that sort of, it's a very black and it's very British thing cludged together with all, those combined weaknesses around honorifics and glamour and superficiality. So I better stop there because I can dig that hole.
No, I appreciate that. One of our actually staff members wants to come on question and ask on camera and ask a question. I'd like to have Courtney Howard join us in the room.
Hi.
Courtney.
My name is Courtney. I just wanted to ask a question as an African American watching Bridgerton and learning about this history. How can we better share this across the diaspora, and how hard was it for you to become a historian and collect all of this information?
Okay, so in terms of sharing it, I mean, it's a personal issue because I don't think there's any institution we can go to or any body that we can appeal to, nor should we. I think it's a collective decision that we have to make, in the diaspora, that of what we're interested in. And the problem with Bridgerton is that it has addressed that interest and that demand for honorifics and big option, and everyone has titles and is of importance. And that's not even particularly interesting, but it satisfies a great need. So for me, the more interesting stories are the stories of survival of the ordinary people, the runaways, people who make these extraordinary decisions on almost a daily basis of how they're going to survive. And, because it's just us, that's us, that's everybody's story. I mean, yes, we can all relate to, say, what's his name, Nathaniel Wells, one of the wealthiest men in South Wales in Chepstow, who was the Sheriff of Monmouthshire, Lord Lieutenant of the county, and fantastically wealthy, man of mixed background. But let's talk about what motivated him rather than look at, his shadow and everything, or the shadow he cast. Look at the man, what's happening inside him. In terms of history, I came through this through the back door because most of my work is in archives and museums, and I started with fiction as well. And I just noticed this whole lack of attention to some of these subjects that I've been trying to share this afternoon. And I just wondered, why don't people talk about it? Why is there this discomfort, not just amongst white British people, some, but amongst some Black British people as well? There's a discomfort with placing ourselves, people who look like me, in different places, doing different things in different ways. And I just like being a cat amongst those pigeons and starting to bite off feathers. So that's what really motivates me.
Incredible. I love cat amongst those pigeons, to be sure. But Steve, we're going to share a message here in a moment from Erilyn Wallen, the composer for this project, who we've been dying to work with for so long. Are so thrilled this is coming to fruition. She's written this opera, obviously, with the librettist Deborah Bavort. You have a personal relationship, though, with Erilyn. Can you share a little bit about how the two of you got connected?
Yes, we're both Londoners and we're both artistes of one sort or another. And we both live and work in and around Greenwich, the beautiful borough of Greenwich. I was with the archives of the National Maritime Museum. Erilyn lives there. And as part of that scene, that social swirl, I've known her in, 20 plus, nearly 2 decades or more. Yes. So, yeah, we go back.
Wonderful. Well, let's hear the composer in her own words. She created this video, and I think we are ready to share it.
So here I am. My name is Erilyn Wallen. I am the composer of Quamino's Map, which the opening scene begins right here in Greenwich, and behind me is this magnificent tea clipper called the Cutty Sark, and I actually just live around the corner. So it's quite incredible when I saw the libretto and saw that Deborah Brevoort had actually commenced the opera in Greenwich. I took that as a very good omen. I have written 22 operas. This will be my 22nd. I've written operas for children, amateurs, large-scale operas, and real miniatures. I've written one that was meant to be performed outside, and it actually ends in somebody jumping into a river. So I've written operas that have been performed in all sorts of spaces, on boats, in clubs, there was one that was performed in a big, massive warehouse, as well as traditional theatres. So opera and anything dramatic is a deep part of my musical personality. And when I read the book on which this opera, Quamino's Map, is loosely based, it's called Incomparable World. I read that book in 2000 and I said, I must one day write an opera or musical stage work. And so now that dream's come to pass, which is great. So the things to watch out for in this opera, our main character is called Juba. He's a recently freed slave from the US. The opera is set in 1780s, so it's after the War of Independence. He buys his passage to come to London, but then is let down by the British Army because then he's destitute on the street. He falls in love with a wealthy black English woman, and so we see a class struggle there. So the music, for me, what's wonderful about these two different countries is getting a sense of the different cultural identities in the music. So you'll hear fiddling music, you'll hear a touch of sea shanty, and then you hear 18th century, almost pastiche. So the instrumentation includes harpsichords as well as a saxophone, as well as brass and strings. So I've tried to write something that's very evocative and colourful, but that also switches in contrast. We have 12 scenes and they run into each other, and by the end of the opera, we've come closer to our characters. And what I'm very excited is that I really love writing for choruses too. So I like to think with this opera, Quamino's Map, it's a story about individuals' search for true freedom, but also we see this search on a large scale and then in small vignettes. I can't wait to share it with you.
Wonderful. I'm so thrilled that all of you got to hear from Steve. Steve, I know you're still on. So good to have you with us today.
And my pleasure as well. And as you've enjoying your lunch, I shall now be enjoying my dinner.
That's right. Well, we will let you to that. We're so thrilled to have you joining us in person for the world premiere of this opera, premiering April 23rd at the Studebaker Theater, and additional performances April 29th and May 1st. Tickets available at cot.org. So with that, Steve, is there any resources that you recommend for folks who are interested in learning more about what you've talked about today?
Yes, I'll make it very easy. Please go online. As this will have been recorded, just look at the writers that I've mentioned. You'll be familiar with Phyllis Wheatley, but Alauda Equiano, Robert Wedderburn, the Radical, and Ignacio Sancho, if you want family, good-humored, witty, punchy stuff. And you can download it all for free.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much, all of you in the chat, for joining us and for being really involved. This was a great discussion. So more soon. See you at Quamino's Map.
Bye.